police officer stops a black teen on a quiet street, accusing him of a crime he didn't commit. But when she learns who his father is, her entire world begins to unravel. What happens next will leave you speechless. The evening air was heavy with the buzz of a busy street. Jordan Hayes, a bright 17-year-old with a head full of dreams, walked briskly home, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The day had been monumental for him. He had just returned from a statewide debate competition where he had taken home first prize. The memory of the crowd's applause was still fresh in his mind, and his lips curved into a small, proud smile. The medal in his backpack felt heavier than it should, not from weight, but from meaning. It wasn't just another win. It was a step closer to proving he could stand tall on his own merits, separate from the shadow of his father. As he rounded the corner, the shrill chirp of a police siren snapped him out of his thoughts. A patrol car slowed to a stop, and Officer Miller stepped out, her hand resting on her belt. Her gaze scanned Jordan with a mix of suspicion and irritation. Jordan stopped in his tracks, pulling his headphones down to his neck, confused by the sudden attention. "You there," Miller called, her voice sharp and commanding. "Where are you headed?" Jordan blinked, startled by her tone, but kept his composure. "Just heading home, ma'am," he replied, his voice calm. "I live a few blocks from here." Miller's eyes narrowed as she approached him. "What's in the bag?" she asked, her tone carrying an air of authority that didn't match the situation. "Let me see." Jordan hesitated, confused by the request. "It's just my stuff from school and a competition I attended," he explained, trying to sound polite. He reached into his bag to pull out his medal as proof, but Miller cut him off. "Hands where I can see them," she barked, her hand moving instinctively to her holster. Her sudden aggression startled Jordan, and he froze, raising his hands slowly. "It's just my medal," he said, his voice faltering for the first time. "I can show you." Miller's eyes darted to his backpack, her expression hardening. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," she said curtly, ignoring his explanation. Without waiting for permission, she snatched the bag from him and began rifling through it. Jordan watched helplessly as she emptied the contents onto the sidewalk. Books, a water bottle, and the shiny gold medal clattered to the ground. "See?" Jordan said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I told you, I'm not doing anything wrong." Miller ignored him, picking up a business card that had slipped out of the bag. Her eyes flicked over the name printed on it. Samuel Hayes. She raised an eyebrow but dismissed it with a scoff, crumpling the card slightly as she tossed it back into the pile. "What's this supposed to be? Your dad's some big shot?" she mocked, shaking her head. "That doesn't mean you get to roam around acting suspicious." Jordan's patience started to wear thin. "Suspicious for what? Walking home?" he said, his tone firmer now. He bent down to gather his things, but Miller's foot shot out, stopping him. "Not so fast," she snapped. "I'm not done here." A small crowd began to form at a distance, their murmurs growing louder as they watched the scene unfold. Jordan's face flushed with embarrassment, but he held his head high. He wanted to speak, to demand an explanation for this mistreatment, but he knew better. His father's lessons about staying calm in such situations echoed in his mind. "Look, ma'am, I'm not who you think I am," Jordan said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. "I haven't done anything wrong." Miller's expression didn't soften. She waved at her radio and called for backup, her actions signaling that this was far from over. Jordan felt a pit grow in his stomach. He wasn't scared. He was angry. angry that his success, his character, and his identity were all being overshadowed by someone else's assumptions. The tension in the air grew heavier as the scene stretched on. The officer's eyes scanned the growing crowd nervously, but her grip on authority didn't waver. Jordan could feel the weight of everyone's stares on him. Somewhere, deep inside, he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger, something he couldn't fully understand yet. But one thing was certain. This encounter was far from over. Jordan stood still, his belongings scattered on the ground like debris from a storm. The faint murmurs of the onlookers grew louder, blending with the sound of passing cars. Officer Miller's face was stern, her posture rigid as she signaled for backup again, her hand still hovering near her holster. The weight of her authority hung in the air, and Jordan's heart pounded, not from fear, but from a growing sense of injustice. "I'm telling you, I haven't done anything wrong," Jordan repeated, his voice firmer now, but still controlled. "You can check my ID. Call my school. I just won a debate competition today." Miller scoffed. "A debate competition? Right," she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Kids like you don't end up in debates. They end up causing trouble." Jordan flinched at the words, but held his tongue. He wanted to fire back, to defend himself, but he knew it wouldn't help. Instead, he stared at her, his expression a mix of defiance and disappointment. His silence seemed to unsettle her, though she didn't show it outright. A moment later, another patrol car pulled up and a second officer stepped out. Officer Harris, a younger man with a more approachable demeanor, looked from Jordan to Miller, his brow furrowing slightly. "What's going on here?" Harris asked, glancing at the scattered belongings on the sidewalk. "Suspicious activity," Miller said curtly, not offering any further explanation. "I'm handling it." Harris's eyes shifted to Jordan, taking in the teen's calm but frustrated demeanor. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice quieter. Jordan nodded but didn't answer. He could feel Miller's eyes on him, sharp and unyielding. Harris crouched down, picking up the medal from the ground. He turned it over in his hand, reading the engraving aloud. "First place state debate championship," Harris said, raising an eyebrow. He stood up and faced Miller. "This doesn't look suspicious to me." Miller's jaw tightened. "He fits the description of a suspect we're looking for," she snapped. "Tall, black, teenage male wearing a hoodie. That's enough reason to stop him." Harris didn't reply immediately. Instead, he looked at Jordan again, his gaze softer this time. "Do you have an ID, son?" he asked. Jordan nodded and reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out his school ID. Harris took it, his expression neutral as he read the name. Jordan Hayes. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, but he handed the card back without a word. "This kid's just heading home," Harris said finally, turning back to Miller. "I think we've got the wrong person." But Miller wasn't ready to back down. Her pride and authority were on the line, and she wasn't about to let them slip away so easily. "I'm taking him in for questioning," she said firmly. "We'll let the precinct sort it out." Jordan's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "I'm not the person you're looking for. And when you find out who I am, you're going to regret this." Miller's laugh was short and harsh. "Is that a threat?" she asked, her tone mocking. "You think you're someone special?" Jordan didn't answer. He bent down to gather his belongings, his movements slow and deliberate. The business card with his father's name on it caught Harris's attention, but Miller snatched it up before he could look closer. "Some fake card isn't going to get you out of this," Miller said, crumpling it slightly before shoving it back into Jordan's bag. "Let's go." As Miller grabbed Jordan's arm, a voice from the crowd interrupted. "Hey, leave the kid alone." It was a store clerk from the corner shop, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She had been watching the scene unfold and had finally decided enough was enough. "He didn't do anything," the clerk said, stepping forward. "I see him pass by here all the time. He's a good kid." Miller turned sharply. "Ma'am, step back," she said, her tone cold. "This doesn't concern you." But the crowd was growing bolder now, their murmurs turning into words of protest. Jordan glanced around, his eyes meeting the clerk's. There was a flicker of gratitude in his gaze, but it was quickly replaced by worry. The situation was spiraling, and he knew it wouldn't end well unless something, or someone, stepped in to stop it. As Miller began leading Jordan toward her car, Harris hesitated. His instincts told him this wasn't right, but his loyalty to his partner kept him silent. For now. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was only a matter of time before it grew into something he couldn't ignore. Jordan sat in the back of the patrol car, his hands resting on his lap, his mind racing. The faint chatter from the police radio filled the car as Officer Miller drove, her grip on the steering wheel tight. Her face was a mask of determination, but her movements betrayed a simmering frustration. She glanced at Jordan through the rearview mirror, her lips pressing into a thin line every time she caught his steady, unflinching gaze. The precinct came into view, its fluorescent lights cutting through the early evening gloom. As the car pulled into the parking lot, Jordan's chest tightened. He wasn't scared. He refused to let fear take over, but he felt a heavy sense of anger mixed with dread. His father had always told him to stay calm in situations like these, but even his father's voice, always so steady and reassuring, felt distant now. Miller parked the car and stepped out, opening the back door with a sharp tug. "Let's go," she said curtly, motioning for Jordan to step out. He complied, his movements deliberate and calm, even as her hand hovered near his arm, ready to grab him if he so much as flinched. Inside the precinct, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and paperwork. Officers moved about, their conversations blending into a low hum. Miller led Jordan past the desks and into a small holding area. Harris followed silently, his brow furrowed. He had tried to voice his concerns during the drive, but Miller had shut him down with a sharp, "Let me do my job." Jordan was seated in a plain chair, the cold metal pressing against his back. Miller stood before him, arms crossed, her gaze hard and unrelenting. She placed his belongings, still crumpled and scattered from the search, on a nearby table. Harris lingered by the door, his unease growing. "Name?" Miller demanded, though she already knew it. "Jordan Hayes," he replied evenly. "Address?" she continued, scribbling on her notepad. Jordan recited it without hesitation. His voice was steady, but there was a faint edge of irritation now, a subtle reminder that he knew this was unnecessary. Miller smirked. "And what were you doing out so late, Jordan Hayes?" Jordan leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting hers. "Walking home from a debate competition. I already told you that." Her smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "And this competition," she said, tapping her pen against the notepad, "anyone who can vouch for you?" Jordan clenched his jaw. "Yes," he said, "my coach, my teammates, the judges. You could call any of them." Miller ignored him, instead picking up the business card she had crumpled earlier. She smoothed it out on the table and squinted at the name. Asterisk, Samuel Hayes, asterisk. She frowned, as though the name tugged at a distant memory, but she quickly dismissed it. your dad, huh?" she said, holding up the card. "Some lawyer or something?" Jordan didn't respond, his silence louder than any words could have been. Miller leaned closer, her voice lowering. "What? You think because you've got some fancy name on a card, you're untouchable?" At that moment, Harris cleared his throat. "Miller," he said, his voice firm but measured. "I think we've got enough here. The kid's been cooperative. Maybe we should—" "Not yet," Miller interrupted, turning on him. "I'll decide when we're done." Harris stepped back, his lips pressing together. His unease was growing by the second. Something about this felt wrong. Jordan wasn't acting like someone who had anything to hide. And then there was the name, Samuel Hayes. It rang a bell, but he couldn't quite place it. As Miller continued her questioning, Jordan's calm demeanor began to rattle her. He wasn't defensive or scared. He was patient, almost as though he was waiting for something or someone. Then the door to the holding area opened, and a senior officer stepped in. Captain Reynolds was a broad-shouldered man with a commanding presence. His sharp eyes flicked between Miller, Harris, and Jordan. The room seemed to shrink in his presence. "What's going on here?" Reynolds asked, his tone clipped. Miller straightened. "Just questioning a suspect," she said quickly. "Fits the description of—" Reynolds held up a hand, silencing her. His gaze moved to Jordan, who met it evenly. Something about the teen's composure seemed to catch Reynolds off guard. He turned back to Miller. "You're questioning Samuel Hayes' son?" Reynolds asked, his voice low but pointed. Miller froze, her face paling slightly. What?" she stammered. Reynolds pointed at the business card on the table. "Samuel Hayes. The Samuel Hayes. You didn't bother to check before dragging this kid in here?" Miller's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Harris shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to Jordan, who still sat quietly, his expression unreadable. Reynolds sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You've got a problem on your hands, Miller," he said, "and it's not this kid." The air in the room turned tense, thick with the weight of realization. Captain Reynolds' words hung between them like an accusation. Officer Miller's confident posture faltered as her mind raced. Samuel Hayes. That name carried weight, though she couldn't yet grasp its full significance. Jordan sat silently, observing the shift in dynamics. His calm composure was unshaken, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of satisfaction. He had tried to warn her. Now the pieces were falling into place. "Miller," Reynolds said, his tone sharper now, "do you understand what you've done? Samuel Hayes is not just any name. He's one of the most respected figures in this city. Hell, in this state. You dragged his son in here without probable cause. Based on what? A vague description?" Miller's face reddened. She tried to muster a response, but stumbled over her words. I was just doing my job," she said weakly. "He looked suspicious and—" "Suspicious?" Reynolds' voice cut through her excuse like a knife. He took a step closer to her, his towering frame looming. "You arrested a teenager walking home because he looked suspicious? Do you realize how bad this looks? Do you realize the kind of storm this is going to bring down on this department?" Harris, who had been leaning quietly against the doorframe, finally spoke up. "Captain, if I may," he said cautiously. "I tried to tell her this didn't feel right. The kid's story checked out, but she wouldn't listen." Miller shot him a glare, but Harris ignored it. His conscience had been weighing on him, and Reynolds' arrival gave him the courage to stand firm. Reynolds let out a heavy sigh and turned his attention to Jordan. "Son," he said, his voice softening slightly. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" Jordan looked up, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine," he said simply, though his tone carried an undertone of restrained anger. "But this isn't fine. None of this is." Reynolds nodded solemnly, understanding the depth of the statement. He knew the damage had already been done, and fixing it wouldn't be easy. He glanced back at Miller, who stood frozen, her earlier bravado completely gone. "I'll be making a call to your father," Reynolds said to Jordan. "He needs to know what happened here." Miller's eyes widened in alarm. "Wait," she blurted, stepping forward. "Captain, I can handle this. I'll apologize to the boy. There's no need to escalate this further." Reynolds turned on her, his face stern. "It's not about apologizing, Miller. It's about accountability. You made a mistake, a big one, and now you're going to face the consequences." As Reynolds left the room to make the call, Miller's shoulders sagged. The weight of what she had done began to sink in. She turned to Jordan, her voice quieter now. "Look, kid, Jordan, I didn't mean for this to happen." Jordan met her gaze, his expression cool and unyielding. "It's not me you owe an apology to," he said simply. "It's people like me, people you judge before you even know them." His words struck a nerve, and for the first time Miller felt the full force of her actions. She had been so caught up in proving her authority that she hadn't stopped to think about the person in front of her, a kid who had done nothing wrong. Before she could respond, the door opened again, and Reynolds stepped back in. His expression was grim. "Hayes is on his way," he announced, "and he's bringing his lawyers." Miller's face turned ashen. Harris exhaled slowly, a mix of relief and apprehension. Jordan remained seated, his gaze steady. The storm that Captain Reynolds had warned about was no longer a distant threat. It was imminent, and Miller knew there was no way to escape it now. The minutes that followed were suffocatingly silent. Officer Miller paced the small holding area, her every step echoing like a ticking clock counting down to an inevitable reckoning. Harris remained by the door, his arms crossed, his expression a mix of guilt and quiet anticipation. Jordan sat in the same chair, unmoving, his calmness becoming more unsettling to Miller by the second. The sound of footsteps approaching broke the silence. Not just one pair, multiple. The air seemed to shift, growing heavier as the door to the precinct opened, and a man stepped in. Samuel Hayes. He was an imposing figure, tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. His presence commanded respect without him having to utter a word. His expression was composed, but with a sharp intensity in his eyes that seemed to cut through the tension in the room. Behind him trailed two sharp-suited lawyers, their faces blank but purposeful, and a younger assistant who held a leather briefcase. The room fell silent as everyone took in the scene. Miller froze mid-step, her face draining of all color. It was one thing to hear about Samuel Hayes, to vaguely know of his influence, but it was another to stand in his presence. He exuded a quiet power that made her feel small, insignificant. Hayes's eyes scanned the room, lingering for a moment on Miller, then shifting to Harris before finally landing on Jordan. His gaze softened slightly as he looked at his son, who rose from his chair, his composure unbroken. Hayes stepped forward and placed a hand on Jordan's shoulder. "Are you all right, son?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Jordan nodded. "I'm fine, Dad," he replied, "but this whole situation isn't." Hayes' jaw tightened and he turned back to the officers. "Captain Reynolds," he said, acknowledging the senior officer who had entered behind him. "Thank you for informing me of the situation. I trust we can address this matter quickly and thoroughly." Reynolds nodded. "Mr. Hayes, I want to personally apologize for what happened here. This was a serious mistake, and we are taking it very seriously." Samuel Hayes gave a faint nod of acknowledgement but didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze settled on Miller. His calm demeanor was more unnerving than if he had raised his voice. "You're the one who detained my son," he said, his tone measured. Miller swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, sir, but—" "No excuses," Hayes interrupted, his voice sharp but controlled. "You saw a young black man walking down the street, and you decided he was a threat. You didn't listen to him, didn't check the facts, and instead you humiliated him publicly. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Miller stammered, searching for words, but none came. The room seemed to shrink around her as Hayes' words bore down on her. Harris shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Miller and Hayes but saying nothing. Hayes continued, his tone cutting. "My son is one of the brightest minds of his generation. He's worked harder than most adults I know to achieve what he has. And yet, you reduced him to a stereotype in seconds. You don't just owe him an apology. You owe one to every young black man you've judged without cause." Miller's face burned with shame. She tried to speak, but the weight of his words silenced her. One of Hayes' lawyers stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we've reviewed the legal implications of this incident. Officer Miller's actions were not only unprofessional, but also potentially unlawful. We recommend proceeding with formal charges of misconduct." Miller's eyes widened in panic. "Wait, formal charges?" she blurted. "This was just a misunderstanding." Hayes turned to the lawyer, holding up a hand. "Not yet," he said, his voice measured. "I want to hear her explain herself." He turned back to Miller, his eyes locking onto hers. "Go ahead," he said. "Explain to me why you thought it was acceptable to treat my son the way you did." Miller opened her mouth, but no words came. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. Finally, she looked down, unable to meet his gaze. Hayes straightened, the disappointment in his eyes unmistakable. "That's what I thought," he said quietly. "You can't justify it because there is no justification." The room remained silent as his words settled over everyone. It wasn't just a reprimand. It was a condemnation, one that Miller would carry long after this moment. And though Hayes had spoken calmly, the power behind his words made it clear. This was only the beginning. The weight of Samuel Hayes' words lingered in the air like a storm cloud, pressing down on Officer Miller as she stood frozen, unable to lift her head. Her hands twitched at her sides as if she wanted to do something, say something, but no action seemed right. Her career, her authority, even her identity felt fragile under the unrelenting scrutiny of Hayes' gaze. Jordan remained by his father's side, standing tall and resolute. He had said very little, but his silence spoke volumes. The contrast between Miller's unraveling composure and Jordan's calm confidence was palpable, and it wasn't lost on the others in the room. Harris shifted uncomfortably, the tension gnawing at him, but he remained quiet. His loyalty to the badge conflicted with his growing sense of justice. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat, attempting to diffuse the situation. "Mr. Hayes," he began, his voice steady but cautious, "I assure you, we will handle this internally. Officer Miller's actions will be fully reviewed, and she will face the appropriate consequences." Hayes turned his sharp gaze to Reynolds. Appropriate consequences? He repeated, his tone laced with quiet incredulity. And who decides what's appropriate? The same system that allowed this to happen in the first place? Reynolds' face tightened, but he said nothing. Hayes continued, his voice rising just enough to command the room without shouting. Let me tell you something, Captain. My son may walk out of here tonight, but this isn't over. It's not about one officer or one incident. It's about a pattern, a system that permits this kind of behavior to go unchecked. You think an internal review will fix that? Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden buzz from the precinct's main desk interrupted him. The officer stationed there called out, his voice cutting through the tension. Captain, we've got a call coming in. It's the mayor's office. Reynolds stiffened. The mayor? Of course. Hayes's influence stretched far beyond this precinct, and the ripple effect of this incident was already spreading. I'll take it in my office, Reynolds said quickly, excusing himself. He shot Miller a warning glance as he left, as if to say, don't make this worse. Miller looked like she wanted to disappear. She glanced at Jordan, then at Hayes, her lips trembling. I really didn't mean— Stop, Hayes said firmly, cutting her off. You didn't mean what? To escalate an innocent encounter into an abuse of power? To humiliate my son because he fit some vague description? Or to get caught? Miller's mouth snapped shut, and she dropped her gaze to the floor. The lawyers behind Hayes exchanged glances, one of them stepping forward. We'll need a complete copy of the precinct's records for this incident, the lawyer said. Every report, every recording, every radio call. If there's anything missing or tampered with, we'll know. Miller's eyes widened. Tampered with? I wouldn't— No one said you did, the lawyer replied coldly, but it's standard procedure when pursuing legal action. Make no mistake, Officer Miller, legal action is on the table. Jordan shifted slightly, his hands slipping into his pockets. Dad, he said softly, drawing Hayes' attention. I don't need her to lose everything. Hayes looked at his son, his expression softening for a moment, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath his calm exterior. This isn't just about you, Jordan, he said. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Before Jordan could respond, another officer stepped into the room. He looked flustered, his uniform slightly disheveled, and he carried a manila folder in his hand. Captain Reynolds asked me to bring these, he said, holding the folder out to one of Hayes' lawyers. It's the preliminary report on the incident. The lawyer took the folder and opened it, scanning the contents. His expression didn't change, but he nodded slightly, as if confirming something. This will suffice for now, he said, but we'll need the rest by tomorrow morning. As the officer left, Hayes turned back to Miller one last time. You'll face your consequences, Officer Miller, he said, his voice quiet but firm. And I hope, for your sake, you learn something from this. Miller didn't respond. She couldn't. Her silence was her only refuge now, but it did nothing to shield her from the weight of Hayes' words or the judgment in his eyes. As Hayes turned to leave with Jordan, Harris finally spoke, his voice hesitant but sincere. Mr. Hayes, I just want to say, for what it's worth, I'm sorry this happened. I should have done more. Hayes paused, studying Harris for a moment. Acknowledging your part in this is a start, he said, but it's what you do next that matters. With that, Hayes and Jordan walked out, the tension in the room lifting slightly but leaving behind an uneasy quiet. Miller slumped into the nearest chair, her head in her hands, as Harris stood silently by the door, the weight of the moment settling over them both. But as Hayes and Jordan stepped into the cool evening air, neither knew that the true storm was still ahead. As Samuel Hayes and Jordan stepped out of the precinct, the cool night air hit them, but it did little to ease the tension simmering beneath the surface. Outside, the street was alive with murmurs and the hum of vehicles. A small group of reporters had already gathered, tipped off by an anonymous source about the arrest of Hayes' son. Cameras flashed, and questions were hurled at them, their voices rising above the clamor. "Mr. Hayes, is it true your son was wrongfully detained? Do you plan to file charges against the officer? Jordan, how do you feel about what happened?" Hayes raised a hand, signaling for quiet, and the reporters fell into a hush. His voice, though calm, carried an undeniable authority as he addressed them. "My son and I have no comment at this time. This is a private matter, and we will handle it through the proper channels." The crowd pressed for more, but Hayes turned his back, gently guiding Jordan toward their waiting car. The driver, a stoic man in a black suit, opened the door without a word. As they climbed in, Jordan finally let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Why didn't you let them have it, Dad?" Jordan asked, his voice edged with frustration. They deserved to know what really happened. Hayes turned to his son, his expression calm but firm. "Jordan, this isn't just about venting anger. It's about strategy. The truth will come out, but on our terms, not theirs." Jordan looked out the window, his fingers fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. He wanted to say more, to argue, but deep down he trusted his father's judgment. Still, the weight of the night's events sat heavily on him. He couldn't shake the image of Officer Miller's face, first smug and confident, then crumbling under the reality of her actions. As the car sped through the city streets, Hayes' phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and answered immediately. It was one of his lawyers. "What's the update?" Hayes asked, his tone all business. The lawyer's voice was steady, but carried a note of urgency. "Mr. Hayes, there's something else you need to know. We've been digging into Officer Miller's record. There's a pattern. Complaints of excessive force, bias, and a few questionable arrests. Most were swept under the rug, but there's enough there to raise serious concerns." Hayes' jaw tightened. "Send me everything you have. This isn't just about tonight anymore." "Yes, sir. One more thing," the lawyer added. "The investigation into that high-profile murder, there's a connection." Hayes frowned. "What kind of connection?" "The officer involved in Jordan's arrest, Miller, was also first on the scene of the murder," the lawyer explained. "And the victim. He had a history with your company. There's speculation he was trying to sabotage one of your major projects." Hayes' face darkened, his mind racing to piece it all together. "Find out everything," he said. "I want a full report by morning." He hung up and turned to Jordan, who was watching him closely. "What's going on?" Jordan asked, his voice cautious. "There's more to this than we thought," Hayes said, his tone grim. "But I need you to trust me and stay out of it for now." Jordan hesitated but nodded. He had learned long ago that his father never acted without a plan. Still, the unease in his chest grew. Back at the precinct, the storm was just beginning to unfold. Captain Reynolds sat in his office, his head buried in his hands as he reviewed the initial reports. The mayor's office had called again, demanding answers, and the media frenzy outside the station was growing by the minute. He knew this incident would tarnish the department's reputation, but what worried him more was the emerging connection to the murder case. Meanwhile, Miller sat at her desk, staring blankly at her computer screen. The weight of her actions bore down on her, but her shame was mixed with a gnawing fear. She knew Hayes' reach extended far beyond her precinct, and the lawyer's mention of legal action wasn't an idle threat. Her career, and perhaps her life, was hanging by a thread. Then the precinct's main phone rang. The officer on duty answered, and his face paled as he listened. "Captain Reynolds," he called out, his voice shaky. "It's about the murder case. There's a new lead." Reynolds stormed out of his office, his gut tightening. "What kind of lead?" The officer hesitated. A witness came forward. "They claim Officer Miller might have been involved. Off the record." Miller's head shot up, her heart pounding. "That's a lie," she shouted, standing abruptly. "I had nothing to do with it." Reynolds' eyes narrowed as he studied her. The weight of her earlier actions, combined with the new allegations, cast a shadow of doubt even he couldn't ignore. "We'll see," he said coldly. "But if there's any truth to this, you're in deeper trouble than you realize." The walls seemed to close in on Miller as the precinct erupted into chaos, and far away, in the back seat of the sleek black car, Jordan Hayes stared out at the city lights, unaware that his father was already preparing for the next move in a game that had just grown far more dangerous. As the car turned onto the quiet street leading to their estate, Samuel Hayes sat in deep thought, his phone resting in his lap. Jordan glanced at him occasionally, sensing the shift in his father's mood. There was more to this situation than his father was letting on, and it was clear that the stakes were higher than he initially realized. The car came to a smooth stop in front of their gated home. The gates opened silently, revealing the sprawling mansion beyond, a symbol of Hayes's success and influence. The driver stepped out to open the door for them, and Hayes motioned for Jordan to follow him inside. The tension followed them through the grand hallways of the house. Hayes led Jordan to his study, a warm room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive oak desk. He closed the door behind them and gestured for Jordan to sit. "Dad," Jordan said, breaking the silence, "what aren't you telling me?" Hayes leaned against the desk, his arms crossed, his eyes heavy with thought. "I wasn't going to involve you in this," he said finally, "but it's clear you're already a part of it." Jordan frowned. "A part of what?" Hayes sighed, his composure faltering for a brief moment. "The man who was murdered, his name was Charles Langley. He was a businessman, but not the kind you'd want to deal with. Shady deals, corruption, blackmail. He was tied to some powerful people who didn't want my latest project to succeed." Jordan sat up straighter. "Your project? What does this have to do with me?" Hayes' expression hardened. "Langley had been trying to undermine me for months. When that failed, he turned his attention to other tactics. I didn't realize it at the time, but he'd started targeting my family. You, specifically." Jordan's breath caught. "What? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to worry," Hayes said. "I thought I had it under control. I didn't think he'd take it this far." Jordan's mind reeled. The confrontation with Officer Miller, the connection to Langley, his father's restrained fury, it all started to make a twisted kind of sense. "Do you think Langley's murder has something to do with us?" he asked cautiously. Hayes nodded slowly. "It's possible, and if it does, it means someone is sending a message." Jordan felt a chill run through him. "And Officer Miller." Hayes straightened, his face darkening. "That's the part I can't ignore. She was first on the scene of Langley's murder. She claims it was random, but now her actions tonight make me question everything. If she's involved, this goes deeper than just a wrongful arrest." The weight of his father's words pressed heavily on Jordan. He had always known his father operated in a world of high stakes and power plays, but this was different. This was personal. "What do we do now?" Jordan asked, his voice quieter. Hayes placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I do what I've always done. Protect my family. But I need you to stay out of this, Jordan. You've been dragged into enough already." Jordan nodded reluctantly, but a part of him knew that staying out of it wouldn't be so simple. He could see the lines of worry on his father's face, lines that weren't usually there. This wasn't just a battle for justice. It was a battle for survival. Back at the precinct, chaos continued to unfold. Captain Reynolds sat in his office staring at the report in front of him. The new witness had claimed that Officer Miller had been seen arguing with Charles Langley just days before his murder. It was enough to cast serious doubt on her integrity. Reynolds summoned Miller to his office. When she entered, her face was pale but defiant. "Captain," she began, "I don't know what you've heard, but I had nothing to do with Langley's murder." Reynolds didn't respond immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes fixed on her. "This witness says otherwise," he said. "They saw you with Langley. They said you had a heated argument. Care to explain?" Miller's jaw tightened. "Langley and I had history," she admitted reluctantly. "He owed me money. I threatened to report him if he didn't pay up, but that's all it was." Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "And you didn't think to disclose this when you were put on his case?" "I didn't think it mattered," Miller said defensively. "I wasn't involved in his death." Reynolds slammed a hand on the desk, making her jump. "It does matter, Miller, especially after what you pulled with Hayes' son tonight. Do you have any idea how this looks?" Miller's defenses began to crumble. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The walls around her were closing in fast, and she knew it. For the first time, she felt truly trapped. Meanwhile, in a darkened corner of the city, an unseen figure picked up a phone and dialed a number. When the line clicked, they spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "It's done," the voice said. "Langley's out of the way. But there's a problem." The voice on the other end replied, calm and measured. "What kind of problem?" "Hayes is starting to dig. If he finds out too much—" There was a pause. Then the calm voice replied, "Take care of it, and make it clean." The line went dead, leaving only the quiet hum of the city night. The glow of the desk lamp illuminated Samuel Hayes' face as he pored over the documents his lawyer had sent. The name Charles Langley appeared repeatedly, tied to shadowy dealings and vague but menacing threats. Hayes' jaw clenched as he read through emails that hinted at Langley's desperation to derail his project. But the deeper he delved, the murkier the waters became. There were names, powerful names, linked to Langley's activities, individuals who had much to gain from Hayes' downfall. One name, however, stood out: Lance Cartwright, a high-profile lobbyist with a reputation for ruthless tactics. Cartwright had always played the long game, aligning himself with those who could provide the most leverage. If he was involved, this situation was far more dangerous than Hayes had initially realized. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Hayes called, his voice firm but weary. The door opened, and Jordan stepped in. He hesitated for a moment before approaching his father's desk. "Dad," he said, his voice quiet, "I know you told me to stay out of this, but I need to understand what's happening. Langley, the cops, everything." Hayes set the papers aside and leaned back in his chair, regarding his son carefully. "Jordan, this isn't a simple situation," he began. "Langley wasn't just targeting me. He was a pawn in a much larger game. There are people who will do whatever it takes to protect their interests, and that includes coming after us." Jordan frowned. "Why? What's so important about this project of yours?" Hayes paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's not just a project. It's an initiative to expose corruption in industries that have been exploiting communities for decades. If it succeeds, it will cost these people millions, maybe billions. They can't afford to let that happen." Jordan sat down, his mind racing. "So they used Langley to try and stop you. And now that he's dead—" Hayes nodded grimly. "Now they're covering their tracks. And I suspect Officer Miller got caught up in it, either willingly or by accident." The weight of his father's words sank in. Jordan's hands curled into fists. "So what do we do?" Hayes leaned forward, his eyes locking onto his son's. "We stay smart, we stay ahead, and we don't let them intimidate us." At the precinct, the walls seemed to be closing in on Officer Miller. She sat in the interrogation room, her head in her hands as Captain Reynolds and a pair of internal affairs investigators questioned her about her connection to Langley. "We need the truth, Miller," Reynolds said sternly. "The longer you hold out, the worse this gets for you." "I've told you everything," Miller snapped, her voice cracking. "Yes, I argued with Langley. Yes, I wanted my money back. But I didn't kill him." One of the IA investigators leaned forward. "Then explain why you were the first officer on the scene and why your report conveniently left out certain details." Miller froze. "What details?" "The witness who saw a black SUV leaving the area just before you arrived," the investigator replied. "The same kind of SUV that were precinct records show you driving earlier that night." Miller's eyes widened, her face draining of color. I didn't." The investigator didn't let up. "This isn't looking good, Officer Miller. Either you're involved or someone is setting you up. Either way, you'd better start talking." Miller slumped back in her chair, her mind racing. The SUV wasn't hers. It had been reassigned to another officer that night. But who? And why was she being dragged into this? Meanwhile, in a dimly lit office across town, Lance Cartwright sat behind his massive desk, his expression cool and calculated. He sipped his whiskey as he reviewed the latest updates on the Langley situation. A man in a dark suit stood before him, delivering the report. "Hayes is digging," the man said. "He's already tied Langley to your network." Cartwright's lips curled into a thin smile. Samuel Hayes always did have a talent for sniffing out trouble, but he's predictable. He won't make a move without evidence, and by the time he finds it, it'll be too late. "And the cop?" the man asked. "Keep her on the edge," Cartwright replied. "She's useful for now, but if she becomes a liability—" He let the sentence hang, his meaning clear. The man nodded and slipped out of the office, leaving Cartwright alone. He leaned back in his chair, his mind already working through the next steps. Samuel Hayes may have been a formidable opponent, but Cartwright had no intention of losing. Not this time. Back at the Hayes estate, Jordan couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through articles about Langley, Cartwright, and his father's work. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but they didn't fit. At least, not yet. A notification buzzed on his phone, and he opened it to find an encrypted message. The sender was anonymous, but the subject line sent a chill through him. "They're closer than you think." Jordan hesitated for a moment before opening the message. It contained only one line. "Trust no one. not even the ones wearing badges. Jordan's pulse quickened. Someone was reaching out to him, someone who knew more than they were letting on. But who? And why did it feel like the ground beneath him was about to shift again? Jordan stared at the cryptic message on his phone, his heart pounding in his chest. The words seemed to echo in his mind. Asterisk, trust no one, not even the ones wearing badges. Questions swirled as he tried to piece together the message's meaning. Who had sent it? And what did they know? He glanced at the time. It was nearly midnight. The house was silent, save for the faint rustle of trees outside his window. Unable to shake the uneasy feeling, Jordan got up and quietly left his room. He padded down the hall, his footsteps soft on the polished floor, until he reached his father's study. The door was slightly ajar, and the warm glow of a desk lamp spilled into the hallway. He hesitated before stepping inside. Samuel Hayes looked up from his desk, his sharp eyes meeting Jordan's. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice calm but weary. Jordan held up his phone, showing the message. "This just came in," he said. "It's encrypted, and I don't know who sent it." Hayes took the phone, his brow furrowing as he read the message. His expression hardened, but he remained silent for a moment. Finally, he looked up at Jordan. "You didn't reply, did you?" Jordan shook his head. "No. Should I?" "No," Hayes said firmly, setting the phone down. "Whoever sent this is playing a game, and we're not going to take the bait. At least, not yet." "But what if they know something?" Jordan pressed. "What if this is a warning?" Hayes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "It could be a warning, or it could be a trap. Either way, we have to be cautious. People like Langley and Cartwright surround themselves with webs of deception. Whoever sent this might have their own agenda." Jordan sat down across from his father, his frustration mounting. "Dad, I'm tired of sitting on the sidelines. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about both of us. If someone's targeting our family, I need to know how to protect myself." Hayes' face softened for a moment, but the steel in his eyes remained. "You're right," he admitted. "You deserve to know the truth, but you also need to understand the stakes. This isn't just business. It's life and death. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and they'll exploit it." Before Jordan could respond, Hayes' phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's Reynolds," he said, answering the call. "Captain?" Reynolds' voice was tense. "Mr. Hayes, we've got a problem. I've just been informed that Officer Miller has gone missing." Hayes straightened in his chair, his grip tightening on the phone. "Missing? What do you mean?" "She left the precinct an hour ago after questioning," Reynolds explained. "No one's seen her since, and she's not answering her phone. We've got officers looking for her, but there's more." Hayes' eyes narrowed. "Go on." "One of the officers in her unit found evidence in her locker," Reynolds continued. "Cash, burner phones, documents, stuff that ties her directly to Langley's dealings. It looks like she was working for him, but it doesn't add up. If she's involved, why would she stick around this long? Why get tangled in your son's arrest?" Hayes exhaled sharply, his mind racing. "Because someone wanted her to," he said. "She's a pawn, Captain. Someone's using her to cover their tracks." Reynolds hesitated before replying. "You think Cartwright's behind this?" "I'd bet on it," Hayes said. "But if Miller's gone, either they've silenced her or she's running scared. Either way, you need to find her before they do." Reynolds grunted in agreement. "I'll keep you updated," he said before hanging up. Hayes set the phone down and looked at Jordan, his expression grim. "Things are escalating faster than I expected. We need to be ready." Meanwhile, in a dark, deserted motel on the outskirts of the city, Officer Miller sat alone in a dingy room, her face pale and drawn. The bag at her feet contained everything she had managed to grab before fleeing the precinct: cash, a few personal belongings, and the burner phone she had hidden for emergencies. Her hands trembled as she dialed a number from memory. The line rang twice before a voice answered, smooth and detached. "You shouldn't be calling me," the voice said. "I didn't have a choice," Miller hissed. "They're onto me. They found the stash in my locker." "That's your problem," the voice replied coldly. "You should have covered your tracks better." "I did everything you asked," Miller said, her voice rising. "I played my part, kept Langley's secrets, even targeted Hayes's son like you wanted. And now I'm the one taking the fall." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When the voice spoke again, it was lower, more menacing. "You're becoming a liability, Miller. You know what happens to liabilities." Miller's breath caught. "No, please, I can fix this. Just give me a chance." The line went dead. Miller stared at the phone, her chest heaving with panic. She grabbed her bag and bolted for the door. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to keep moving. But as she stepped into the cool night air, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Farther down the street, the engine of a black SUV roared to life, its headlights slicing through the darkness. The rumble of the SUV's engine reverberated through the quiet street, sending a jolt of fear through Officer Miller's chest. She clutched her bag tightly and broke into a run, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. The sound of tires crunching on gravel grew louder behind her, and she didn't dare look back. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she darted down a side alley, the shadows swallowing her. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding, as the SUV rolled slowly past the alley entrance. The headlights briefly illuminated the space, and she held her breath, praying the driver wouldn't see her. The SUV paused at the mouth of the alley. Miller's eyes darted to the other end. It was too far to make a break for it without being spotted. She stayed frozen, her back pressed against the cold brick wall. A bead of sweat trickled down her forehead as the engine idled, the tension suffocating. Finally, the SUV moved on, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. Miller exhaled shakily, her legs trembling. She knew she couldn't stay here. They were hunting her, and it was only a matter of time before they caught up. She pulled out her burner phone and dialed the only number she could think of: Captain Reynolds. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before his gruff voice answered. "Miller," Reynolds barked. "Where the hell are you?" "I need help," Miller whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "They're after me. I don't know who, but they're not cops. I think it's Langley's people, or worse, Cartwright's." Reynolds' voice hardened. "Miller, you've got yourself into a mess I can't protect you from. The evidence we found—" "I was set up," she hissed, cutting him off. "They planted that evidence to make me look guilty. I didn't kill Langley. I didn't even know the full extent of his dealings until it was too late. Please, you have to believe me." Reynolds was silent for a moment, weighing his options. "All right," he said finally. "Tell me where you are. I'll send someone to get you." "I don't trust anyone else," Miller said quickly. "Just you." Reynolds sighed heavily. "Fine. Stay put and don't do anything stupid. I'm on my way." The call ended, and Miller tucked the phone back into her bag. She knew Reynolds' arrival wasn't a guarantee of safety, but it was her only hope. She stepped cautiously out of the alley, her eyes scanning the empty street. The quiet was unsettling, every shadow and corner a potential threat. Then she heard it. the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming closer. Miller's breath hitched as she spun around, her eyes searching the darkness. A figure emerged, their face obscured by the brim of a hat. They stopped a few feet away, their posture relaxed but radiating menace. "Officer Miller," the figure said, their voice smooth and cold, "running won't save you." "Who are you?" Miller demanded, backing away. Her hand instinctively reached for the small handgun she had tucked into her bag. The figure chuckled softly. "You know who sent me, and you know why I'm here." Miller's grip tightened on the gun. "Stay back," she warned. "I'll shoot if I have to." The figure tilted their head, unconcerned. "You won't," they said calmly, "because if you do, you'll never make it out of this alive. You're in deep, Miller. Too deep." Miller's mind raced. She knew they were right. Pulling the trigger would only escalate things, and she was already outmatched. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The distant wail of sirens broke the tense silence, and the figure stiffened. They glanced towards the sound before turning back to Miller. "You're lucky," they said. "For now." Without another word, the figure melted into the shadows, leaving Miller standing alone, her chest heaving. The sirens grew louder, and moments later, Reynolds' unmarked car screeched to a halt nearby. He stepped out, his face set in a grim expression. "Get in," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Miller climbed into the passenger seat, clutching her bag like a lifeline. "They were here," she said, her voice shaking. "They know everything." Reynolds's jaw tightened as he pulled back onto the road. "Then we need to move fast," he said, "because this isn't just about you anymore. It's about taking them down before they get to Hayes. And his son." Miller's stomach twisted at the mention of Jordan. She had been a pawn in a game far larger than she'd realized, and now the pieces were falling into place. But one thing was clear. If they didn't act quickly, more lives would be at risk. And this time, there would be no escape. The car sped through the darkened streets, Reynolds gripping the wheel tightly as his mind raced. Officer Miller sat beside him, her eyes darting nervously to the windows, half expecting the black SUV to reappear at any moment. The weight of the night bore down on both of them, but neither spoke until the precinct was far behind and the city lights faded into the distance. "You're going to tell me everything," Reynolds said finally, his voice low but firm. "No more half-truths, no more omissions. If I'm putting myself on the line for you, I need the full story." Miller hesitated, her hands gripping her bag like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. "It started with Langley," she said after a long pause. "I owed him money, a lot of money. He loaned it to me when I was desperate, and when I couldn't pay him back, he made me work for him." Reynolds glanced at her sharply. "Work how?" "Looking the other way," Miller admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'd run operations, smuggling, illegal deals, and he needed a cop on the inside to make sure things went smoothly. I didn't want to do it, but he had leverage. If I didn't comply, he would have ruined me." Reynolds exhaled sharply, his grip on the wheel tightening. "So you became his fixer?" Miller nodded reluctantly. "But it wasn't just me. There are others, higher up, people who've been working with Langley and his associates for years. I was small time compared to them, but they used me because I was disposable." "And now that Langley's dead," Reynolds said grimly, "you're a loose end." Miller swallowed hard. "Exactly. They're tying up everything that could lead back to them, and I'm next on the list." Reynolds pulled into an empty parking lot and cut the engine. He turned to face Miller, his expression steely. You said you targeted Hayes's son. Why? Miller lowered her gaze, shame flickering across her face. Langley told me to, she said. He wanted me to shake him up, make him feel vulnerable. I didn't know why at first, but now I think it was a message to Hayes, a way to intimidate him. Reynolds shook his head, disbelief etched into his features. You had no idea what you were getting into, did you? No, Miller admitted. But now I'm in it, and I don't know how to get out. Reynolds stared at her for a long moment before pulling out his phone. We're not going back to the precinct, he said. It's compromised. If Cartwright's people are embedded in the department, we can't trust anyone there. We're taking this straight to Hayes. Miller's eyes widened. Hayes? You think he'll help me after what I did to his son? Reynolds started the car again, his expression unreadable. Hayes doesn't care about you, he said. But if what you're saying is true, this is bigger than revenge. He'll want to take Cartwright down just as much as we do. Maybe more. Back at the Hayes estate, Samuel was still in his study, staring at a map of interconnected names and events spread out on his desk. Jordan sat nearby, scrolling through the encrypted message again, his mind racing with questions. Dad, Jordan said suddenly, if Miller was working for Langley, why would she risk everything but going after me? It doesn't make sense. Hayes didn't look up from the map. Langley wasn't acting alone, he said. Someone higher up was pulling the strings, someone with a vested interest in keeping me distracted. Cartwright, Jordan guessed. Hayes nodded. Most likely, but Cartwright isn't sloppy. If he's involved, then he's already 2 steps ahead. He knew Langley was a liability, and now he's cleaning house. Miller might be next, or she might be the key to exposing him. Either way, we can't ignore her. Before Jordan could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel drew their attention. Hayes stood, moving to the window. His face hardened as he saw Reynolds' unmarked car pull up outside. They're here, Hayes said. Jordan followed him to the door as Reynolds and Miller stepped out of the car. Miller looked shaken, her eyes darting nervously toward the shadows, but Reynolds moved with purpose, his expression grim. As Hayes opened the door, Reynolds wasted no time. We need to talk, he said, his voice firm, and you need to hear what she has to say. Hayes' eyes flicked to Miller, his expression unreadable. This better be good, he said, stepping aside to let them in. Inside, Reynolds wasted no time explaining what he'd learned. Miller sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as Reynolds detailed her confession and the connections to Langley and Cartwright. When Reynolds finished, Hayes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. He regarded Miller for a long moment, the silence in the room almost unbearable. You've put my family at risk, Hayes said finally, his voice low and controlled. But if what you're saying is true, you might have the information I need to end this. Miller nodded, her voice trembling. I'll tell you everything. Just, please, help me. Hayes stood, his commanding presence filling the room. If you're lying, he said coldly, you'll wish Cartwright had found you first. Miller swallowed hard, her fear evident, but deep down, she knew there was no turning back. Whatever happened next, she was in too deep to escape now. And as Hayes turned to Reynolds, his voice steady but resolute, he delivered the words that would set the next stage in motion. We're going to take them down. All of them. The weight of Samuel Hayes' declaration hung heavy in the room. Reynolds leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and spoke cautiously. If we're going to take down Cartwright and his network, We need evidence. Real evidence. Real evidence, not just Miller's word. Hayes nodded, his sharp mind already piecing together the puzzle. We start with Langley's dealings. Miller, you worked closely with him. What did he leave behind? Miller hesitated, her eyes darting between Hayes and Reynolds. Langley kept everything, documents, recordings, backups, but he was paranoid. He didn't trust anyone completely, not even Cartwright. He had a secure storage locker in the city where he kept his insurance. Insurance? Jordan asked, finally breaking his silence. You mean blackmail material? Miller nodded. Exactly. If we can get to it, we'll have everything we need to expose Cartwright and his entire operation. Hayes' jaw tightened. Do you know the location of this locker? Yes, Miller said, her voice steadying, but it won't be easy to access. Langley used a biometric lock, only he could open it. Reynolds frowned. And now he's dead. Miller shook her head. There's a backup method, a physical key he gave to one of his associates. If we find the key, we can get inside. Hayes stood, his commanding presence filling the room. Then we find the key. Miller, who has it? She hesitated again, the weight of her answer evident in her expression. Lance Cartwright himself. The following night, Hayes, Reynolds, and Miller sat in a nondescript van parked outside Cartwright's sprawling downtown office. The city lights reflected off the glass building, masking the shadows within. Hayes's team of private investigators had spent the day tracking Cartwright's movements, pinpointing when he would be at his most vulnerable. This is insane, Jordan said, sitting in the back of the van. Despite his protests, Hayes had allowed him to be there, but only under strict orders to stay out of the action. It's necessary, Hayes said firmly. Cartwright won't see this coming. He thinks he's untouchable. Reynolds adjusted his bulletproof vest and checked his weapon. If this goes south, we're all going down. Are we ready for that? Hayes gave a small, confident smile. I've faced worse odds. Miller sat silently, her hands trembling slightly. This was her chance to make things right, but the fear of failure loomed large. Cartwright always keeps the key on him, she said quietly. A silver USB drive on a chain around his neck. That's what we need. Hayes nodded and looked at Reynolds. We stick to the plan. Get the key, get out, and get the evidence. No unnecessary risks. Reynolds opened the van door, the cool night air rushing in. Let's do this. Inside Cartwright's office, the tension was palpable. Hayes and Reynolds moved with precision, slipping past security cameras and guards using intel gathered by Hayes' team. Miller followed closely, her nerves fraying with every step. They reached Cartwright's private office, the door locked with an advanced security system. Miller pulled out a small device from her bag, connecting it to the panel. Give me a minute, she whispered, her fingers trembling as she worked. The door clicked open, and they slipped inside. Cartwright's office was lavish, its sleek design a testament to his wealth and power. On the desk sat a glass case containing a stack of documents, a laptop, and a safe embedded in the wall. There, Miller said, pointing to the case. That's where he keeps the backups. Reynolds moved to the case while Hayes scanned the room. Where's the key? He asked quietly. Before anyone could answer, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. Hayes turned sharply, his instincts kicking in. We've got company. The door burst open, and Cartwright stepped inside, flanked by two armed guards. His cold, calculating eyes landed on Hayes. Well, well, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Samuel Hayes breaking and entering. That's not very dignified of you. Hayes stepped forward, his expression unyielding. "This ends tonight, Cartwright. Langley's dead. Your operation is crumbling. Give us the key, or I'll make sure the whole world knows what you've been hiding." Cartwright chuckled, shaking his head. "You're out of your depth, Hayes. Do you really think you can stop me?" Reynolds raised his weapon, his voice steady. "Try us." The tension reached a boiling point. One of Cartwright's guards moved to draw his gun, but Miller reacted faster. She grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it with all her strength, knocking the guard off balance. Chaos erupted as Hayes and Reynolds engaged the remaining guard, the office descending into chaos. In the commotion, Hayes spotted the chain around Cartwright's neck. The silver USB drive gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, grabbing the chain and yanking it free. Cartwright roared in anger, but Hayes didn't falter. He turned to Reynolds and Miller. "Go, now!" They bolted from the office, alarms blaring as they made their escape. Guards flooded the hallways, but Hayes' team had planned their exit route meticulously. Within minutes, they were back in the van, the USB drive clutched tightly in Hayes' hand. The following morning, news outlets exploded with the revelations Hayes had uncovered. The contents of the USB drive included detailed records of Cartwright's dealings, implicating not only him, but also several high-ranking officials. Langley's murder was tied directly to Cartwright, and the corruption within the precinct was exposed. Cartwright was arrested, his empire crumbling overnight. Miller, though complicit in some of Langley's operations, cooperated fully with authorities, earning her a reduced sentence. She vowed to use her second chance to help others who had been victimized by the system. As for Hayes and Jordan, the ordeal brought them closer. Standing in their study, Hayes placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "We did it," he said quietly. Jordan nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "No," he said. "You did it. I just watched." Hayes chuckled softly. "You watched, but you understood. That's what matters. One day, you'll take this further than I ever could." Together, they looked out the window at the city, a new dawn breaking over the horizon, a dawn that promised hope, justice, and a brighter future.